Good evening and welcome, and thank you very much for being here. I'm very happy that Teresita Fernández is with us here tonight. Thank you so much for coming. I think that for those of us who are working in the field of architecture, there's a long history of dealing with the outside of buildings, with the facade of buildings, with the image of buildings. And I think that you know that probably more recently there has been greater interest in the understanding of the way in which buildings are actually perceived rather than the kind of messages that they convey with their exteriority. The experiential has become more important. And I think it's fair to say that we have a lot to learn in that sense from the work that Teresita has been doing. I suppose another example that would be of relevance to landscape architects is, for example, the tradition of the 18th century English landscape, where we see the organization of the park with the winding paths, and it looks very naturalistic, but at the same time, the organization of that landscape is really something that's very much based on the way in which the body moves through the landscape. And I've seen this word, ambulatory perceiver, as something that's been applied to Teresita's work, in the sense that the experience of the work is not focused on the image of the work, but it's actually on the way in which the body participates in the perception of that work. Therefore, I think this issue of the way in which the body is implicated in the making and the perception of the work is something that is really very relevant in terms of how we make buildings, how we make landscapes, how we understand and experience cities. I'm very happy that we will get to see this work. Teresita's work has also been recognized nationally and internationally. She received a MacArthur Foundation Fellowship in 2005, and then a Guggenheim Fellowship, a National Endowment for the Arts Artist Grant, and so the list goes on. More recently, she's been appointed by President Obama to serve on the U.S. Commission for Fine Arts, which is a panel that advises the Congress on significant monuments and building projects. Teresita's work has also been, of course, shown in many different places and galleries, and I just heard that she's about to open a major exhibition at MASS MoCA in the spring of 2014. So please join me in welcoming Teresita Fernández.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here and to get to present some of my work to you. You know, it's kind of funny as an artist who, oops, I'm starting to get, sorry. As an artist who sort of was brought up, you know, who went through universities in sculpture departments, which are very particular kinds of things where people make big things and there's a whole sort of, you know, power thing happening. It's very funny because I always made big things, and at some point I started to get associated with architecture, and I've always thought if you're a sculptor, an artist who makes sculptural things, and you make something big enough, people start thinking that it's sculpture. And so I've always, for one reason or another, I've always enjoyed all of these possible reads on my work, either from architecture or from landscape architecture or from a kind of cinematic point of view. And early in my career, I was certainly very influenced by a lot of feminist architecture theory, as well as a lot of feminist film theory, and all of the things that one sort of got if you went to school in the early 90s and were bombarded with identity politics and all of that. However, those things didn't really manifest themselves in my work in very obvious ways. And I sort of took from a lot of things and borrowed from a lot of things, but I actually don't know very much about architecture at all, or landscape architecture. And I say that because it's been a great benefit to me to not be an expert in anything, in the sense that what I'm dealing with and what I have to offer to you today when I present my work is that I've managed to carve out a way of creating a kind of intimacy, which I think is a word that people have forgotten how to use. We've actually forgotten how to address the idea of intimacy, not privacy, not public-private. It's different. It's about sort of honing something so that there's a kind of experiential and emotional reaction, a kind of lived moment in reaction to something. So if anything, that's the thing that I'm interested in. I'm going to go ahead and start. I'm going to start with a few earlier works, and then I'll show work from more recent, from the last few years. This is a piece called Borrowed Landscape. In it, I was trying to think about this idea of merging the idea of a decorative interior and a decorative landscape, an indoor landscape and an outdoor room. And I was looking at the time at a lot of 17th century formal gardens, European formal gardens, like Vaux-le-Vicomte, like Versailles, more Vaux-le-Vicomte, but Versailles is certainly a better an example that people can relate to more readily. And I was always interested in how those formal gardens were always represented from this bird's eye view. And how if you stand at the back of the chateau and you look out onto that vista, what you have is a kind of compressed pictorial space, so that the foreground, the middle ground, and what's in the distance appear flattened, and you only see certain things. You never actually experience it the way it's always represented in plan, which is sort of almost the cliche of the landscape. So what I was interested in, and perhaps the place where I converge with architecture, one of the points, is in that ambulatory viewer. Borrowed Landscape was made out of these 5 volumes, which I'll show again, and they were covered with these very, very tiny pencil drawings that were a pattern made up from many parterre patterns from formal gardens. And so you could walk around it, but Borrowed Landscape, by the way, is a bad translation of a traditional Japanese gardening technique called shakei. And in shakei, so that the Japanese interior is traditionally very dark, with open walls, as you know. And so there's this kind of blurring between indoors and outdoors. And the way that sort of opening functions is very much like a kind of diorama. But shakei, if you translate it more properly, it actually means to capture alive. And so I was interested in how I can create real spaces that you walk around, where that sort of merging between what's close to you, what's in the middle distance, and what's in the background start to become blurry, to dissolve into one another. And these are all, it's a language really of the two-dimensional. So many of our conventions in dealing with landscape come from two-dimensional representations, and we've kind of just adopted them, and we use them to mean three-dimensional things, but they're actually very much grounded in the two-dimensional. This is a piece called Bamboo Cinema that I did with the Public Art Fund in New York City, and it was sited in Madison Square Park in the middle of the city, right next to Italy. there before Italy was there. And it is a kind of labyrinth of concentric circles, like a circular maze. And you could walk through it. There's no sort of trick to it. It's very, very, very low tech. It's these tubes that I had made, and they have like these little tiny green pinstripes that have been embedded into them. So it just functions very much like an early cinematic device. And while people think they know how that works, I'll just repeat it because it's actually something that's important to understand to break down all the other work that I'm going to show you after this. But if you look at these early film studies of Muybridge, the way, when you go to the movie theater, when you see a film projected, what makes that film appear to be moving is persistence of vision. So you have one film still, it's projected, and then the shutter closes. And then the next image appears, and then the shutter closes, and that happens at a very fast speed over and over and over again. Now, the part that interests me has less to do with the sort of mechanism of film or projection even. It has to do with how you as a human being perceive these images that you're being bombarded with constantly. And what happens when that film still is projected and that shutter closes is that first image retains as a ghost image on the back of your retina when there's no image. And then the next image appears. And if you do that fast enough, they appear to be connected. So this is exactly how bamboo cinema functioned. Each one of these verticals was like a shutter that just interrupted your vision. And so whether you were moving or someone else was moving, everything started to become distorted as it zoomed in and out. If a yellow cab went by Fifth Avenue, it would just sort of enter and become distorted as it went through the piece and pop back out again on the other side. And in this piece and in many pieces, there's this sense of the viewer not being this generic viewer, which it's always such a bad term to refer to how it is that we experience things. I always prefer the word reader more than viewer. Viewer implies this sort of roving eyeball that goes around something. Like we never are quite sure who that viewer is, especially when we talk about art. But if you think of a reader, if you think of what happens when you really read something, you're constructing images in your mind's eye. And it's what I feel that the sort of present viewer, for lack of a better word, does when they're experiencing engaging places, whether they're architectural or landscape-oriented or artworks. So in this work, there's a sense that the viewer is somewhere between a performer and a spectator that sets the piece into motion. At the time that I installed this, as a footnote, at the time that I installed this in the park, it was when Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon came out. And it was very interesting to see how people used the piece. They really were they had a very dynamic reaction to it, and often every day pieces had to be replaced because everyone wanted to fly over it. This is a piece that I did around the same time. Conceptually, it's very similar to what's happening in bamboo cinema, except it becomes much more fine. So I kind of took that whole effect that I just described, and I made it into these very minute, sort of very detailed silk strings. When I was doing it, I was thinking about how I can kind of harness, not illustrating fire, but the kind of behavior of fire, and why it is that certain things become hypnotic. Why is it that we could stare at moving water or moving fire and be completely transfixed by it for no apparent reason? There's no meaning to it, but it becomes something very universal, and there's an undeniable reaction to it. And I was interested in trying to pinpoint what it is that does that, what it is that causes that response in us, which is not just visual. It's a bigger investment of oneself in producing those images, like the reader that I just mentioned. So the fire is made out of silk yarn. There's a steel armature. And if you look at this, there's a space underneath it. So the whole thing is actually just hanging from that silk. And each one of these little silk strands that has been dyed, and I'll actually go through the process, is again like that shutter that interrupts. And so the whole thing starts happening, but in a much more detailed way. And as you walk around it, the color appears to be suspended. So it really is almost like a kind of painting moving in space. And I wanted to go through a little bit, because I think what lectures are good for is to explain the creative process and how it is that one gets from point A to point B. It's something that you can't do when the artwork is actually literally in front of you. So I want to walk you through how it is that I arrive at that. If I showed you the early models of fire, they're these clunky plastic things that just really don't transcend the material whatsoever. And I thought, well, how is it that I'm basically trying to defy gravity. I'm trying to present you with something that convinces you, even though it's very low tech and how it's done is very evident, that it somehow still takes you there. The way when you read a book, you can be completely transposed by what you're reading, invested in it, and yet know fully well that it's just a story. How is it that that happens? So at the time, I had visited this place called Scalamandre, which is this wonderful place that used to be in Long Island City that made historic textiles. And I walked into their factory room, and I saw all of these mechanical looms moving, many of them with gold and silver threads. And I thought, that's exactly what I need to do. What I'm trying to do is to create a loom that's just suspended in space. And so I worked with Scalamandre to develop this piece, and also with the Fabric Workshop and Museum. This is silk being dyed. I'm going to walk you through the process, because it's there's never any. One of the things that's interesting about an artist talking to architects is it's really important to recognize that we never get a brief. Okay, there is no brief. The brief is non-existent. And so a huge part of one's problem is coming up with a problem. And it is probably the single most difficult thing that one does as an artist, is to define what is that question, why is it meaningful, and what do I learn from asking that question? It's something that I encourage you to try as an exercise, to try to think outside of the brief. But because we don't have clients or sites necessarily, or parameters, or lots of things, there's this sort of really scary blank of how is it that you generate those questions. And then there's the second part of it, which is how do you make that? If you don't even know the question, the second part of it is how do you come up with solutions to find a way for this thing to manifest itself into an artwork. And so all of that kind of takes you literally down a rabbit hole of having to try lots of different things in very unconventional ways. So I want to walk you a little bit through how we figured out how to make this piece. I worked with a weaver who finished the tops and bottoms of those silk strands. And there was just lots of real scale trial and error. I make models too, but when I'm actually trying to figure out how something works, I can only do it at real scale. This is what my studio looked like at that moment, where in order to create the effect, fire is made out of 2 concentric rings. So anywhere you stand around the piece, you're looking through 4 layers of silk thread that have all been dyed. And if the distance between those layers became really, really crucial, so that if they were too far away from one another, you would see straight through them to the back of the room. If they were too close together, you would see solid red or orange. And so the piece starts out with this little diagram that you see on the left of this image, which was just this squiggly line that I made representing the contours of the image of the fire. And the colors on it are all made with these 10 colors that you see here used to dye the silk. Silk is incredibly strong. It's a really quite fascinating material in that when you dye it, you have to heat it, and it changes the molecular structure of the actual silk. So it's not like paint on the surface of something. So that little drawing that you see back there was turned into real-size, full-size templates. And those templates were put in front of these panels of silk thread. And it's a very blind process. I'll talk about blindness a little bit more, as I think it's actually a very important part of how I work, is always with a kind of blind element. So with silk, you have to apply about 45% more color than you actually use. So you have no idea what it's going to look like until afterwards. And so this is the people I was working with adding. By the end, it looked like a 70s horror film. Carrie. And then, so all of those panels are washed, steamed for 3 hours, and then the color becomes an integral part of the silk itself. This is a piece called Ink Mirror, and it is made of high polished black fiberglass and marble dust, and it's partially based on this little thing, which is called the clawed glass. Clawed glass it's a black mirror. Sometimes it was made out of obsidian, and it's a piece of curved postcard side. And it was used in the early 19th century as a kind of viewing device by painters who wanted to paint like Claude Lorraine. And so what they would do is they would go out into the landscape with this little device, and they would stand with their back to the scene, landscape scene that they were painting, and they would hold it up so that they could see the scene that they were painting reflected in the black glass. So it's not a true reflection because it's black. It only catches the deepest shadows and the brightest highlights. I like to think of it as something that we do in Photoshop now by just, doing some high contrast function. But what it allowed them to do was to kind of visualize something so that it would look like the paintings of Claude Lorraine and that they could paint it. Oddly enough, it was also used by pilgrims who would go around different sites. I think this is supposed to start. Yeah, it was used by pilgrims who would walk, go through different sites in England and arrive to some abbey and then turn around and use the same little device just to look at it, almost like a postcard that could capture a reflection. So to make a long story short, what was fascinating to me about this little object was the idea that you would turn your back to something in order to see it better. And it implied that what you would be seeing was something that you couldn't see if you looked at it straight on. And it's a theme that you'll see over and over again in a lot of my work. This is a piece called Longing Double Portrait. It's made out of black onyx and glass with silvering, basically mirrors. So this is the onyx, and these are the pieces of convex, polished, handmade little mirrors. So the viewer in the whole space is reflected upside down and reversed into each one of these little convex units. Again, I was dealing with the idea of distortion, with seeing yourself outside of yourself. There is, again, it's called Longing Double Portrait. There is a sense of portraiture in a lot of my work, except it does not look like traditional portraiture. It's not literal. And so here's Flemish painter Quentin Matsys, The Money Changer, and his wife from 1514. If you look at this, you'll see that there's a kind of indirect figurative element that appears over and over again. Again, that distortion that shows us a new way to see the same thing that's right in front of us that we don't see. This is a piece called Seattle Cloud Cover, which is in downtown Seattle in an urban park there called the Olympic Sculpture Park that was designed by Weissman Freddy. This was brownfields when we got the site. And so I developed this. I kind of fell in love with this site because I knew that this pedestrian overpass that I was building would be over the train tracks that run through the city. It's made out of laminated glass with a photographic interlayer. And this is just a little animation. So the trains, so what I loved about the trains going underneath is this plane that you walk on, which was my piece, was almost like one motion superimposed on another motion. So the motion of you walking on top of this plane that had the rumbling trains underneath, a little bit like when you walk on an escalator. And I love the idea of the sort of, I liked the unsettling sensation that implied. It's a montage that's made of thousands of images of clouds that I took in Miami. I tried to make them in Seattle, but there were no good clouds in Seattle, so I ended up taking them in Miami, which has fabulous clouds. And the whole thing is, it has these openings, these clear openings that if you look to the left, if you look to the right, you see Puget Sound and the Olympic Mountain Range. If you look to the left, you see downtown Seattle. And so again, that idea of seeing and not seeing, the image being projected and the shutter closing. Each one of these little circular images, of these little circular openings, was the place where the image of downtown Seattle appears and then it disappears. This piece changes a lot throughout the year. There are certain times where it looks very watercolory, almost see-through. There are other times where it's very, very intense. And I wanted to, I always like to show reference images with this particular piece because there's a very subjective connection between images that strike a chord for me, and the process is not logical or linear, and it's one of the things I'm really interested in. A little bit like poetry, where each word is sort of exquisitely precise and specific, but the finished product is elusive and layered and hard to name. So it's really all about the effect. It's something being more than the sum of its parts. And so when I made this piece, I was thinking about a lot of things. I was thinking of Géricault's Wrath of the Medusa in 19th century French romantic painting. I was thinking of Hokusai's woodcuts. This is two men washing a horse in the waterfall from 1838. I was thinking of the saturated backgrounds in Japanese anime. This one's embarrassing. I was thinking of the surreal and slightly comical, kitschy clouds in the backgrounds of Maxfield Parrish paintings. And you know, the disclaimer on the Parrish is, of course, Parrish is not a big influence, but if you have a book lying around your house when you're a little kid that's of a particular artist, you have an attachment to certain images that are more than just intellectual connections of things that you learn in school. And so, you know, I always kind of loved those clouds. And they appeared again. They were really part of the piece. I was thinking of the dissolving saturated color fields of Rothko, which always seemed to me to be suspended in midair. And the piece changes through the seasons. It's actually, it looks very different at different times of the year. When you walk underneath it, and the light, it sort of sits right under the horizon, and at times, you know, everything becomes colored, so the whole structure just kind of disappears, or, you know, the color filters onto your clothes. And you can see downtown Seattle appearing in and out of those little circles. This is a building that was supposed to be designed by Herzog and de Meuron and wasn't. It's the Blanton Museum of Art in Austin, Texas. Great museum. They ended up not doing the Herzog and de Meuron building at the last minute, and they ended up with this really very mediocre building by a local architect, and it was a really problematic space. And so, as often happens, artists are often called in to fix bad architecture or to give it meaning. It happens all the time. Usually we say no, unless we're brought in at the beginning when infrastructure is being figured out. But I looked at this space and I thought, gosh, this is such an alienating space. Like, there's really nothing to do with it. You couldn't hang anything on the walls. The skylights, yeah, there was great light in there, but that you couldn't hang anything. So it was like an architectural nightmare. And I ended up doing this piece, which is still there if you ever go to Austin. It's actually going to be in a Terrence Malick film that's being filmed there, so you might recognize it if you see the movie. But it's called Stacked Waters. And what I did is I basically just thought of, and it was the other part that's really bad about the space is that there's a whole arcade that goes around it. It's like, it couldn't be worse. It had like bad architectural move on top of bad architectural move. And I thought, there's no way to do anything in here. And then I got this idea to just think of it as a kind of ancient Roman cistern and fill it up with water. And so I lined the whole thing with this polycarbonate that I had cast for me, so that the colors, I mixed the colors like a painting, so that they go from blue to white as they move up. The title Stacked Waters is, of course, a reference to Donald Judd, who has a huge presence in Texas. And it was the title is sort of an inside joke to myself, because I thought at some point that it kind of looks like being on the inside of a Judd piece. You can see the blue sort of emanating from all the corners of this, no matter where you are in the museum. And you have to go through this space in order to get up to the galleries. So everybody comes through this space. And it's a cistern. And so what I did is it slowly fades up to white, and there are 50 steps going up. And by the time you get up to the top, that white line, it's like stepping out of a pool, that white line is to about your ankles, and you step out. The piece, again, like a kind of, in a Judd, very Judd-like way, becomes a mirror of the atmospheric conditions. So it really is a sort of portrait of the changing Texas light. And it can be very, very sort of dynamic and bright reflections, very watery. It could look very somber if you look at it at certain times of the day. This is the Seto Inland Sea in Naoshima, Japan. I've spent a lot of time in Japan. I lived there for a while, and I've been back every year for the last, I don't know, maybe 17 years. So it figures prominently in a lot of I think in a lot of my visual thinking. I did a piece here. Naoshima is a little island in the Seto Inland Sea. It's a very sort of ghostly, otherworldly landscape. And you may recognize it. It's been photographed a lot by Hiroshi Sugimoto. Those black and white images of the sea, they're the Seto Inland Sea. This is where they were taken. And Naoshima, you also may know it because it's where Ando's museum is, Chichi Museum. Chichu means literally below the earth. The whole museum is underground. And this is one of the buildings. This is actually the hotel that Ando designed there. Naoshima, it's a fishing village. It's a really undeveloped little island except for the museum. And so I was asked to do one of the walls in the museum of this Ando building, which was a very long, curved ramp wall that's about 50 feet long. And that faces windows that look out onto Naoshima. This is a night shot of my piece. There was no artificial lighting, and so the only lighting that it has is moonlight at night and just daylight. This is it at night. This is what's in front of it. And again, the piece really becomes like a portrait of the changing light outside. Everything is mirrored onto the surface, so this is what's outside, the windows that face it. And the piece is made out of these many, many tens of thousands of little handmade glass cube mirrors. And so you also see yourself in them sort of broken up into this massive puzzle. But it really was a lot about painting as well, like these little just miniature landscape paintings over and over again. And again, it's a very dynamic piece because when you move, you experience it in a totally different way. But to segue, I was here in Naoshima doing this piece, and I spent a lot of time walking around the village, old fishing village. And one of the things that they do in this part of Japan, in Okayama and in this part of in the islands near Okayama, it's very hard to get here, by the way. Trains and cars and ferries. So what they do is they burn the wood on all of the buildings as a way of preserving it. It's called shosugiban. And it's a traditional Japanese technique for charred to burn the cedar so that it doesn't catch fire, basically, which is an interesting concept that you would burn something so it wouldn't catch fire. There are very old buildings with it, And then there are new buildings. It's done in factories now. And if you touch it, it's literally like charcoal. This is a piece of a very old building with the Shosugiban. And it's a very beautiful effect, which I won't do it justice by describing it. But it's so shiny that it actually looks blue because it's reflecting the sky. So I realized when I was walking around through all these little narrow streets and these burned buildings that I was kind of I was in a drawing. I was walking around a charcoal drawing. And I was fascinated by this idea of a landscape drawing, not a landscape painting, but a landscape drawing. This is the first known dated work by Leonardo da Vinci of the Arno Valley from 1473, and it's believed to be the first landscape made from memory. So not documenting something, but remembering it, constructing it. Again, that reader fabricating images in your mind's eye. And it's the first example I'm talking Western here now, I'm not talking China. That's a whole other landscape conversation, which I will also refer to. But in the West, this is really believed to be the first example of landscape for landscape's sake. So not the representation of a landscape as a background to something, or to show the place where someone in the foreground is coming from, but rather just landscape for its own sake. So I thought, well, what is the history of landscape drawing? And it took me down another one of those rabbit holes. And I asked myself, well, what are pencils and what are pencils made out of? And there was this whole sort of material investigation that led me to graphite. And so I did tons of research, and I realized that graphite was first discovered in the early 1500s in Borrowdale in Cumbria, which is a rural part of England, in the Lake region. And in this place, Borrowdale, there was an enormous deposit of this really amazing quality graphite. And to this day, there's never been a deposit of that quality found. Those mines are all depleted now. This is a picture of Borrowdale. And I thought, well, it's kind of like if you were standing here, all of Borrowdale would be like standing on one big solid drawing. And I was fascinated by that. This is the entrance to one of the mines. So I found graphite. Graphite's mined all over the world, but not of the same quality. So you can get graphite in New Jersey, but it's not going to be of the same quality as this. It doesn't have the same luster. So the graphite that I use comes from one particular mine in Sri Lanka, and it has a very high luster. It's very soft. You'll see more pictures of it. And so I started making these drawings with chunks of graphite, with actually pieces of graphite, so that from far away, they kind of looked like flat, abstract, modernist black paintings. And a more intimate view, as you got closer, the dark image would slowly emerge when you get close to it, to show the relief quality and catching the light. And again, there's that sense even in the wall pieces, even in these wall drawings, of the ambulatory viewer. So it's almost like being in a dark room and watching an image develop by the fact that you're moving around it. And so what starts out as this sort of, Ad Reinhardt black painting from far away, from close up becomes, something much more lush than like some sort of traditional Turner-esque, picturesque representation of the landscape. And I'm really interested in that fine line between something being completely abstract and being very representational or recognizable. And where that fine line is precisely where viewers, for lack of a better word again, or readers have an emotional response. This is a piece called Drawn Waters, Borrowdale. And it is a drawing that's a sculpture and a sculpture that's a drawing. So to me, it's all made out of solid machined graphite, and then the bottom is what graphite looks like when it's mined out of the earth. So for me to assemble this piece was to draw. Again, I was looking at a lot of Leonardo da Vinci's studies of moving water. And you can see here the kind of vocabulary that I started to make with this raw material. I had it machined, I had it polished, I had it raw. And it's an interesting departure in that it really touches upon not just landscape drawing, but landscape sculpture, which is a term, it's a non-existent term. Nobody talks about landscape sculpture. that's different than land art. So certainly I was thinking of Smithson's Asphalt Rundown in Rome from 1969, this idea of drawing on the landscape. But what I was trying to do was actually more like a three-dimensional version of what we experience when we look at landscape painting. This is Passaic Falls in Passaic, New Jersey, where Smithson explored so many of his ideas of urban ruins, and documents the monuments of Passaic. And this is a piece that I did called Nocturnal Passaic Pour, referring to it. That's the falls frozen. It's just it's a nice idea that it's a kind of sculpture. It's a photograph of a sculpture of a place, because somehow when it was frozen, it felt more like a sculpture. And so in the background, here's the piece that I just showed you in the foreground. In the background is a piece called Epic. And I had looked at a lot at this 19th century woodcut of this really spectacular Leonid meteor shower that took place in November of 1833 that could be seen all through the Western Hemisphere from Halifax to the Gulf of Mexico. And people were really kind of in awe and scared when this happened. There are these accounts, these first-hand accounts written about this event where people literally thought that the sky was falling. And I was really taken by it, and you'll see that image pop up in a lot of my work. This is Epic. So with Epic, these are all little chunks of graphite, a real piece of graphite. If you take it, you can draw on it. It's the same thing that's in your pencil, just a bigger piece of it. And there's a drawing underneath it. So each one of those marks is made, and then the piece is actually attached to the wall. And I was really interested in where the verb and the noun converge. So when you say drawing, you know, it's the act of drawing, it's the verb drawing, but it's also the noun of the drawing, and where it becomes this thing that teeters in between the two-dimensional language and the three-dimensional language, because it's really more of a sculpture. This is called Night Writing, the series that I'm going to show you. And I, again, in relation to drawing and writing, I was thinking a lot about the night as the night sky as a legible surface, and these very sort of universal cosmic references. The show that I'm doing at MASS MoCA is actually all about this, but you know, really the stars are our first calendar, our first clock, the place where we as humans have always looked for orientation. It's the first form of navigation since the beginning of time. And so we like to look at it as this kind of historical thing outside of us, but it really is sort of like the clock, the time, the way the universe keeps time. Inside of us as well as outside of us in terms of materials and places and everything else. So I was interested in how I could work with that idea. I was in Singapore at the time, and I did this project with the Singapore Tyler Print Institute, which is a fascinating group of master paper makers, basically. So the works that I'll show you have dimension to them. They're built-up pulp. And while the pulp is wet, there's a pattern blown out with pressurized air, which is what all those little holes are. This is one of the finished pieces. So in the early 19th century, Napoleon ordered someone in his army to come up with a system so that soldiers could communicate at night silently and without light. And one of the captains in the French army, named Charles Barbier, he invented a code called Écriture Nocturne, or night writing. And it was basically consisted of a piece of cardboard with holes in it that corresponded to the French language, to phonetic sounds in the French language. And the idea was that one soldier could pass it to another soldier quietly in the trenches without using light and communicate. It was a really inefficient system. It did not work. A couple of years later, he gave a lecture about night writing at the Institute for the Blind in Paris, which was the first Institute of the Blind anywhere in the world. And there was a young teenager in the audience named Louis Braille, who basically just took the idea of night writing and perfected it so that he simplified it so that each cipher could fit on the tip of the finger. And it's what we call Braille. So I was super interested in this idea, this connection between the tactile and the visual. And my interest in blindness that I've mentioned over and over again tonight has less to do with the eye. It's less physical and more about not seeing. If you all of a sudden if you use the expression not seeing instead of blind, you can interpret what I'm trying to say in a very different way. So if you rephrase blindness in terms of varieties of not seeing, shadows, darkness, inaccessibility, denial, cloaking, peeking, squinting, hiding, camouflaging, these two are degrees of blindness, though they're less specific to the physicality of the eye, and they're more inextricably linked to thinking, dreaming, imagining, making those visual constructions in our mind's eyes. So in these pieces, the pattern that you see, which is stars and constellations, is actually Braille. And the visual, and it says something, there are sort of epic texts in all of them, the visual, untouchable Braille becomes absurdly illegible to both the blind and to the sighted. The two languages are sort of superimposed on one another, the text and the Braille, and they obliterate one another so that the meaning of every word is sort of rendered mute. So it's really about abstraction. The words become invisible. The text becomes really ephemeral, but it's hiding in plain sight. So it's saying something, but you don't know what it is. So it's this ultimate abstraction of looking and reading. There are these very long ones. These, for example, this one's called Tropic of Cancer, and what it does is it's a kind of imaginary line, and the Braille traces every name of every city that the Tropic of Cancer cuts through, which if you look at as a list is a very funny sounding list. So behind this whole thing, there's a mirror, and so each one of those little holes lights up, and there's a little reflection in it. And again, that idea of the viewer as both spectator and performer, there's this dynamic element. As you move in front of it, the reflection of the activity of you moving and the whole space itself is sort of sparkling in these and tiny little reflections over and over again. There was also a sculpture, that big installation that was part of this, because I also wanted people to not just look at this as an abstract idea, but to experientially be standing in that sort of bodily, occupying that bodily space of looking up. This is all made out of polycarbonate tubes that I had made for me, and what I did was I worked with a factory in California so that all the tubes that they normally throw out because they're transition colors, I just got them to it's like I had every possible color ever, so they ran all these different colors without stopping the machine, so it's just like one continuous color. And you could see the piece from above and from below. And this is the last piece that I'll show. This is called, I'm going to talk about a piece called Yellow Mountains. Yellow Mountains is a reference to Huangshan. Huang means yellow, Shan means mountain, and you may all know it because you probably do a lot of trips there, but it's the iconic mountain range outside of Shanghai in Anhui province. And I can't overestimate, I can't stress enough how important this particular mountain range, Huangshan, is in Chinese imagination. Pretty much every important Chinese poem or painting in art history, in Chinese history, is a reference to this particular land, this particular place. From the Tang Dynasty to the end of the Qing Dynasty, over 20,000 poems were written about it. And I did this piece that came from this topography of the Yellow Mountains of Huangshan, which I flipped upside down to occupy the place above the viewer's head. The whole thing was made out of pyrite, And again, this interest in mining, if you'll see, a lot of my materials are references to materials that are mined, and that connection between the subterranean and the cosmos, whether it's gold or pyrite or galena and other minerals that I've used. This is a piece, there are thousands and thousands of little pieces of pyrite that hang from this piece. And here you can see that sort of topographical, flipped topography of the Huangshan Mountains over your head. That's it. I'm going to stop there because that's 46 minutes and better to not be too tired. If anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Or not. That's fine too, but I'm happy to take one. Yes?
It seems like the work is a lot about visual and emotional touching of people who experience it. So I'm wondering, anecdotally, pieces that, every time you experience them or durationally, that visually and emotionally touch you in ways that you're trying to with your work.
Repeat the question.
There seems to be an awareness of like a visual and an emotional touching in these spaces, and so that sort of thing, and works not by you that you anecdotally linger with in similar ways with the ways that they visually or emotionally touch you by their embodiment of space or embodiment of ideas. And
yeah, I'm interested in emotional responses to things because I feel like, it's not something people talk about because they don't have a language, they don't really have a vocabulary to talk about it. And we're not taught to talk about emotional response to design or art or anything else. But, and maybe there's another word, maybe it's engagement, maybe it's a kind of suspension, maybe it's a kind of, you can fill in the blank. It's sort of, we don't want to have to get into semantics. You can fill it in with whatever you want. But it is, I think the word that I've been using more lately, because I feel that it really pinpoints it, is intimacy. And I think it's become a very valuable thing to try to attain. And it's funny how that, I'm really interested in language. I'm interested in etymology of all kinds of things. But it's interesting to see how, like if you look at the word transparent, if you look up, if you look up the word transparent, its use in history and its etymology, it kind of like from the 1800s kind of goes like this. And then you get to 2010, and it goes like this. And you can identify it in almost every Obama speech ever made. And so the way we use the word transparency is completely different than how our grandparents used the word transparency. If you look at the night writing series that I showed you, completely tied into our history of language. People used to really look up at the stars to figure things out. So the word disaster means bad star, or the word consider. It means to considerare. It means to look at the constellations. And so it's really like what you see as just a word separate from you. It's actually really ingrained in people doing things. And language is an interesting way of breaking that up. When you do that, and when you tell the anecdote, the way I do about how I arrive at an idea, it's easy for you to connect emotionally because I'm telling you a story that connects all the pieces. But when I'm doing it, I don't know what that story is. I have to create that story. I have to be in Japan in a fishing village and see the side of a burned building to think about where graphite came from. And it's not logical. And those are interesting problems to set up for oneself, because when you set up the strategy of logic, you end up with the same thing that everybody else does. that was something that when I was teaching at Princeton with David, was interesting to me, that the brief is the same, and so the logical path always spits out the same. There are only certain permutations, but the minute you sort of throw in a monkey wrench and you change up how you do it, something else comes out the other end. I'm really interested in that. And when that works, you get intimacy, whether it's landscape design or architecture or art or poetry or music or reading. We don't know what else to call it. We'll call it that for now. And I do think it's emotional. If anything, it's only emotional. Yeah. So, yes.
Oh, just to follow that thread, because I follow up your question, you said something so interesting. You said that someone can have an emotional response when the line between the figurative, you said figurative and abstract, was maybe blurred. Or I don't know if you could just describe that a little more and break it down a little more. I'm so fascinated by that.
Well, yeah, you know, it has to do with how we've been taught to think about things. And so, you know, if you take abstraction to a certain point, which people did in painting and in architecture many generations ago, to nothing, like this minimal block or this black painting, you think there's nowhere else to go, right? Well, like, that's the end, and all you can do is start adding things again. But it's a ridiculous notion to think of that as the end of something or the ultimate abstraction. And so for me personally, I don't know how to speak about abstraction in other people's perception of it, but in my own work, there is no difference between the original sort of reference, you know, which may be something very recognizable, and the way that that's abstracted. In fact, when it works, when abstraction works, it distills an image or whatever, an idea, down to a point where all of its original characteristics are still there, you know? It's just invented a different form. But the connection, the you know, that intimacy that one has with, you know, why is it that people who don't know how to, you know, who don't know how to look at art, who aren't taught to look at those things, why is it that they reject things that they cannot recognize? Because there's no way of understanding it. So the minute that you explain it, you know, visually or the way I just did anecdotally, all of a sudden there's something to like, because you understand where abstraction, the distillation process of abstraction. But as makers and creators, I think the problem that we all have is, how is it that you distill something in a very personal way? And how is it that you start to ask questions that really only you can answer, because they're not standard questions? You know, and it has to do with paying attention. I'm convinced that it has to do with paying attention and looking, and not looking for things. I think it has to do with looking at things in the real world, with living, with being in the real world, with occupying real spaces. At least in my experience, that's usually how I learn the most. And you know, the other stuff, the theory, the formal part, we all know how to do that. We really don't impress each other very much. We're all kind of bored with it, right? Like, you learn it, you go to school, you learn it, you know how to say it, you know how to defend your work that way. But after you've done it, it's not very interesting anymore. Like, when you are in your studio by yourself after you graduate and you've learned how to use that language of theory, it becomes really boring really fast. But you have to learn it to unlearn it. Yeah. Yeah. Good. Okay, well, thank you so much.
Thank you.